Welcome, comrades, to the latest session in our series, Lives of the Left. Tonight, we are looking at Victor Serge, the Russian Marxist, writer, revolutionary, who remained very critical of Stalinism, although he was, in the Soviet Union. So it'll be an interesting session tonight, no doubt, and very grateful for Matthew Jones for doing the introductions. 30 to 40 minutes, I think, is the usual format. And then if you have any comments or questions, please click raise hand and we'll bring you in. Thank you, Matthew.
Okay. All right. Hi, comrades. And thanks for coming to tonight's session. The thing about Serge, of course, is that obviously he's actually an anarchist as much as anything else as well. As an anarchist and a Bolshevik and a revolutionary and a writer. I mean, a revolutionary, but more really a writer. He was a brilliant writer, and he had, for the fact he died at the age of 56, he packed in a lot in his life. And you have to say that this will be a very brief tour, and I'm sure I'll leave out a lot. Well, I will leave out a lot. So feel free, if to bring other things in. I think the thing is also, of course, is that it's about really the fact that he refused to submit to Stalinism among a very small number of people, and he then also escaped the system, which is really quite exceptional. So he then survived to go to Mexico. So really, the story starts. Serge is, if you like, is born into the Russian Revolution more than anybody, almost more than anybody else. I mean, even Lenin, whose brother was killed, hanged by the regime after attempting to kill Tsar Alexander III. Serge's father actually was involved in the plot that successfully killed Tsar Alexander III, the second, in March the 1st, 1881. Was a member of the People's Will, and that Narodnaya Volya. And escaped. He fled after the successful assassination. His family actually were Montenegrin and a priestly clan in Ukraine. And one of his distant relatives was actually much closer to the whole assassination, was actually hanged for that. So the relative was Nikolai, and his father was Leon. Nikolai is also famous later for the fact he devised the idea of manned rocket flight, although of course he never got any close to do it. So Nikolai Leon escapes from Ukraine in the end, over into Austria, as it's said in the legend, with the border guards' bullets whistling over his head as he swam across the river, and flees to Geneva, where he meets Serge's mother. Serge's mother, of course, is from Nizhny Novgorod in the south of Russia. Actually, her family are close to Gorky, Maxim Gorky, the great novelist, and it forms a useful connection for Serge later. And Serge is born in Brussels, almost as an accident, because his family are commuting. His father spends some time in London, and of course they're existing in great poverty. And in fact, one of Serge's brother, Raoul, actually died of basically deprivation. So Serge is born right at the end of 1890, the last few days of 1890, which is a sort of the prime years of Russian Revolution for Russian revolutionaries. Certainly, the sort of that generation. He's 2 years younger than Bukharin. He's actually a few days older than the poet Osip Mandelstam, who himself was murdered by Stalin, and writes the great line when he's in prison. And I was born in the unreliable year of 1891, and the centuries surround me with fire. And that really sort of sums it up in some ways. So Serge, he doesn't go to school. His father doesn't take him to school. He actually teaches him to read himself, and Serge basically educates himself. So it's quite an extraordinary process. He says in in his memoirs, of course, that his father worked with him occasionally, not very well, but obviously he managed to inspire him to read and write and to read, quite widely. His original political involvement, actually, in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1900s, is with the young guard, young socialists of the Belgian Socialist Party, part of the Second International. But obviously, he's not inspired by this. He spends a few years in there, but he's much more inspired by anarchism, because obviously, as he puts it, anarchism is much more individually demanded that sort of, that people look at themselves and that they operate in certain ways and all this sort of thing. Whereas I think he finds the Belgian Socialist Party quite sort of flabby, and despite its previous history of strikes and so on and so forth. So he sort of devolves to the anarchists, joined an anarchist commune in Belgium. And then finally, of course, as all such good youth of such time, having left his parents, at a very young age, he never saw his father after about the age of 15 or 16, and devolves to Paris, where of course, all these things happen as the great political centre. He becomes involved with his original group, the sort of individualist anarchists, as I say, this sort of individualist thing, and therefore is on the fringes. An editor of starts writing articles in the early part of in the 1900s, and becomes editor of L'Anarchie, along with his first wife Rua, by 1910, 1911. And he's on the fringes of what became known as the Bono Gang, in which basically a bunch of anarchists took to robbing banks and shootouts of the police and so on. And the state was determined to stamp these people out. So they basically went around and captured, killed quite a lot of people, captured other people. Serge was then hauled in on the basis that he was obviously, quote, as a theoretician, although there was no evidence against him, other than they produced a couple of guns that they said they found in the office and the paper. So as he said, he then goes to trial. He's then shoved into trial. As I say, this time he's in his very early 20s, and he's, as he said himself, there was no way he was ever going to get let off. Despite the fact that they couldn't produce any evidence, he was always going to get done. So 4 of the guys on trial get the guillotine. A number of others get prison time, etc., etc. The women get off. As he says that in Paris they never convicted women of many offences, including political ones. So he's then sent to Melun jail outside Paris, which is still there. I was discovering the thing is still open. There's now a debate about how they're going to close it, but it's still open, which is a hellhole. Melun jail is, Serge is expected to die on at least one occasion. Such was the appalling treatment. And at this point, of course, this is he's sent there just before the First World War. The war breaks out in the middle of this, and he's in jail, and he's actually quite close to obviously quite close to the front. People start leaving the town. The warders are terrified, but of course, as he says, he could then see, and that obviously the one great thing was that the Russian regime, this thing that obviously had dominated his life and family and so on and so forth, was never going to survive the First World War, which is a great thing as far as he's concerned. And the Russian Revolution would form this great light and the gate, as he said, the gateway to the future, which he's right, it's true. So he spends the rest of his time spends 4 years in jail, say nearly dies, eventually is kicked out of jail with penniless, which is quite common for Serge. He fairly frequently found himself penniless, and is expelled from France, winds up in Spain. This is in 1916, 17. And then there, of course, he meets the Spanish anarchists, the CNT, and is present for the sort of the start of the great uprising in Barcelona, which culminates in 1919, as we spoke earlier on this some months ago. and meets all these Spanish revolutionaries. As he says, this is the second generation. Obviously, he's the great survivor, so he survives, his time with the individualists as one of the few survivors. He then, of course, meets all these Spanish anarchists and works with Spanish anarchists, particularly, of course, Salvador Seguí and Pestaña and all these people, leading people, and then there, of course, after the 1919, of course, they're all killed too. I mean, obviously, he leaves Spain well before that. Unfortunately, of course, at the time when he goes to Barcelona, his wife leaves him as well. After a small rising in the middle of 1919, he goes back to France in an effort to get back to Russia, because obviously the revolution's broken out, and the question is, how do you get home, because this is where it's all happening. And of course, what happens, unfortunately for him, he doesn't wind up in the army, unlike many of the other people who wind up in the army. And as he said, what happens, of course, is that when they demand various things, they're either shot or in the trenches, or else, as he said, the representatives are shot slightly by the back behind the front line. He's thrown in the camp, with a whole lot of other people, seeking to get back to Russia of assorted varieties, including actually a Jewish, Russian Jewish anarchist called Alexander Rusakov. Eventually, Serge actually marries his daughter. So he actually marries into an anarchist family as well. So it's very heavily linked with the anarchists. He is then, the process, of course, is then he and others are exchanged for people who are held by the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. He makes it into Petrograd by early 1919, where he discovers, obviously, the place is wrecked. They're in real danger. Obviously, the whites are everywhere. There's a complete mess. Things are breaking down all over the place. But obviously, then they have to survive against the whites, and by a miracle they do. I mean, as Lenin actually said himself, at one point, so we're just waiting. We're actually dead. We're just waiting for somebody to come and finish us off. And he speaks actually of the siege of Petrograd, the effort by the whites to break into Petrograd, which is broken by Trotsky. Actually, I think obviously his great respect for Trotsky arrives, particularly from this point where Trotsky arrives with his train and says, well, okay, we have a white army on the gates, but this is a major proletarian center, and we will not submit to an army of a few tens of thousands of officers, and therefore was able to mobilize and break the whites and destroy whites at the same time, obviously holding off the Finns, because it was down to the Finns to actually deal the death blow against Petrograd, because obviously the whites didn't have the forces. Serge describes a very interesting transaction, of course, is that the Bolsheviks had a trade with the Finns. They would buy, as he says, quite beautiful Mauser revolvers from the Finns, still in boxes, with Tsarist banknotes that they printed specially, and of course that were completely worthless unless the Bolsheviks were actually defeated. So they were buying themselves the ability to remain undefeated while their opposition was giving them that means in exchange for worthless banknotes, which would only be worth anything if they were defeated, which is sort of a quite surreal piece of capitalism, if anything. If anything there was. So Serge then works for as he says himself, I mean, he hadn't read Marx. I think this is the first, it's this point he starts to read Marx. Obviously Marx is not heavily published, because obviously, if you look at it, many of the works of Marx, of course, are published rather later. And it's not something he's actually studied. So it's actually his contact with the Bolshevik Party that brings him towards Marxism. And he joins the Bolsheviks. As he said, points out, the most convinced and able, and what actually makes the revolution. Nothing else will do it. And he joins the Secretariat of the Comintern. As you say, even through Kronstadt, in which his anarchist comrades were persecuted, and then through things like he describes, obviously the funeral of Kropotkin, who he held in very high regard. I mean, he read Kropotkin as a young revolutionary, and it's as you said, the last time the anarchists were able to put them, publicly appear on the streets of Russia was the funeral of Kropotkin in Moscow. And he sticks to the Bolsheviks despite all this, because he can see there is no alternative. But obviously, given the state of the wreckage, he moves to leave Russia